In the previous episode of Narrative Mechanics, we spent our time laying conceptual foundations for understanding this Dramatica table of story elements. And if you missed that program and would like to see it, there's a link down below the video in the description that will give you a good understanding of the basic concepts before we get into today's material. Now today, we'll be going into much more detail of what this chart actually means in terms of narrative structure. But we're also going to look into details within the chart itself and see these 4 different families of story elements that we described last week. And finally, we're going to move on to a whole new projection of that chart, as if it were expanded upward into these towers that look something like a cross between a 3D chess set and the periodic table of elements in chemistry. And in fact, that's not too far from the way they actually operate. This will give us our first glimpse as to how it's not just a structure as you see in this image, but it can be twisted and turned. This structure is a narrative at rest, where there's no dramatic tension anywhere in it. But if you twist it and turn it like a Rubik's Cube, every time you do that, you're winding it up as if you're tightening springs, and that creates the dramatic tension that determines how a narrative is going to unwind over time. Well, very interesting concept to look into, but it's also a little bit complex, and we'll get there at least for an initial look, and then future episodes will go into far more detail. All right, returning now to this first image, let's add a little bit to that. We talked about how universe, physics, mind, and psychology, going clockwise around the table of story elements, are the families of elements in narrative, the same way that the rare earths and the noble gases are families in the periodic table in chemistry. You know that a family has elements in it that share similar characteristics. They're not identical. And so if you substitute one for the other, you get a completely different molecule or compound or reaction. But they do have similar characteristics, so you know that they're going to do something more like this than like that. And that's true in chemistry. When you look at fluorine and chlorine, you know that they're not going to be the same as, say, gold. They won't operate the same, but fluorine and chlorine will operate very similarly. Here in the Dramatica table of story elements, all the elements in universe will act differently than those in physics, but they will be similar in and of themselves into the kind of thing they're doing. Now, what kind of thing is that? Well, last week we talked about how universe, for example, was a fixed situation. You can look at universe and physics and see that those deal with things external in the external world. And mind and psychology deal with things in the internal world, within ourselves. Now, universe is a fixed situation, and physics, up in the corner there, physics is an external activity, like a race or a chase or a process that you have to carry to fruition before you get what you want. Universe is like being stuck in a cave. You can't do anything about it. You're trying to get out, but as long as you're in there, that's the problem in the narrative. You're in this fixed situation. Or you could be the elephant man, where the fixed situation is your actual body. That's in universe. It's not in mind and psychology. Mind and psychology is how the elephant man would deal with it. But universe would be describing the story in which it's all about somebody who's stuck in this position. Or maybe they're second in command. Or maybe they've been shipped overseas and have no way of getting back. Or they're stranded on a desert island. Any of these are universe stories. African Queen is a physics story where something has to take place to get something. And a lot of action adventures, you'll find them in physics as well. Psychology is a story about thinking things through. And if you're thinking them through wrong, like we had the example of Hamlet, then you end up having somebody who's overthinking the plumbing, and he misses the opportunity to avenge his father's death until he ends up dying, and so many other people he cares about are in a bad way or dead. Whereas the same kind of psychology story would be if you had The Imitation Game with Cumberbatch in it, where he portrays Alan Turing, and they are trying to work out the psychology behind the Enigma machine that the Germans created to encode their communications. And at the same time, he's dealing with his psychology of trying to relate to people and understand how one can deal with human beings, very much like Sheldon Cooper in The Big Bang Theory. He falls right into the psychology realm. In mind, of course, that's where you have a fixed attitude that's causing the problems in the story, which could be something as simple as Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, where his attitude is causing all these problems, or it could be a story like To Kill a Mockingbird, where it's the prejudice that the people in the town have against black people that won't allow this one black man wrongly accused of raping a white girl be tried justly, be given a fair trial. And so that's a mindset in To Kill a Mockingbird. So with this, we understand that you're going to see the elements that make up all the things we see in narrative in this chart. Now, similar in the periodic table, you're not going to find such things as salt. It's just not going to be there because you have sodium and you have chlorine. They're in the chart. When they come together, they make salt. So these are the elements of story structure, the elements of narrative. And there are a lot of things that you might expect to be there that aren't there because they have to be manufactured by the structure and the dynamics ranged into a certain pattern. And that pattern then becomes these compounds at a higher level that are made out of these elements. All right, let's move down from that a little bit. We'll be coming back to these things here and there throughout this series as we have more to say. But if we look at this one upper quad here, up at the upper left, universe, and we can see that there's another level below it that has larger words, past and progress. I'm trying to put my cursor on these, future and present. Okay, past, future, and present are familiar, but progress is not. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But every one of these groups of four is called a quad. And they're at different levels. Quads within quads, wheels within wheels. That's why we see the 3D projection, is so that we can look at those different levels independently and see how they might turn and twist and rotate. All of that could be independent of the other levels, and it creates different kinds of dramatic tension. Pretty complex. That's what this series is all about. Narrative mechanics. It's not trying to teach you to write a story. It's not trying to teach you how to analyze a story. We've got other videos for that. This one is to actually tell you what's going on at the subatomic level of narrative structure. All right. We'll notice that universe, which we see up here in that fourth, then down here we see past is to universe. Here's an analogy. Past is to universe as memory is to mind. You can begin to get a sense of what it means to have that item in the left-hand corner compared to its family, memory to mind, in the hierarchy at the next level up. Very similarly, we might say that obtaining in physics, an activity of obtaining, is similar to a psychology of becoming. Why? Becoming is when you've actually turned into something new, a new kind of identity. Conceptualizing and conceiving, that's just coming up with ideas. But being and becoming is very similar to doing and obtaining. And here's why. If you're being a certain way, it's almost like play acting. It's almost like just putting on the show, walking through the motions, hitting the marks, phoning it in. When you're being a certain way, you're not turning into that. An actor who is being a certain way on stage probably is not that way in real life. If they play the part long enough, they might actually slip into that and become that, okay, where it's actually their nature. But you ultimately are being a certain way, and eventually you may be becoming, just as you might be doing things that eventually lead to obtaining. Now, the reason I bring this up is you can see the relationship between doing and obtaining under physics is the same as the relationship between being and becoming in psychology, the same angle in the chart, and that's important. We'll talk more about that later. I'll leave you with a little thought on this one about you don't become something just by being Okay? You don't become something just by being like it is, but you also have to not be like it isn't. While you're chewing on that for a moment, let's go down here, as I promised, to this 3D chart. It turns out, although you can't see all the names on here, it turns out that there are 4 levels of narrative. So it's 4 wide and 4 down. And these families continue to get deeper and deeper. And every top level family is kind of an umbrella that generally describes the family of the 4 elements underneath it. And each one of those 4 elements underneath describes the family of the 4 elements under that, until you get down to the very bottom. Now, the reason for that is that that's the way the mind works. The mind works fractally. We first ask ourselves, if I were to go, let me go back up to this chart. We ask ourselves, I have a problem. I need to solve it. First, I have to identify where it's coming from. Is it coming from some fixed situation, or is it coming from some activity going on in the world? Is it because of the way I'm thinking about it, or is it because of the attitude that I have toward it? Those are the questions we need to answer in order to understand where the problem is coming from. And we can't always see it. We have projection, where we project our belief of where the problem is somewhere else. It turns out when you twist and turn that Rubik's Cube of story down here, that the final phase of that twisting and turning, the 4th twist, as it were, everything's in 4s, the 4th twist actually shifts between the outside and the inside. So when you're making excuses for not solving the problem, when you're refusing to deal with it and want to just put it away and try and put it back in your mind or balance it or forget about it, you come up with 4 layers of putting some pearl around the grain of sand that's irritating the clam of your mind. And when you do, you end up the final stage projecting it outward or projecting it inward. You either say, oh, no, I'm not the problem. They're the problem. That's the problem. Things outside myself are the problem. Or you end up saying, no, it's not everybody else. The problem is me. I'm the problem, when really it isn't. But you've come to accept that because the costs you would pay to solve it in an area that you're uncomfortable with are greater than just blaming yourself, for example. There's a lot of complex psychology that comes out of this model. And this is just an introduction to show you that it exists. Another thing I'll tell you is, if you look at this whole model here, the meaning of the story is not in any one of these things, but in the middle, which is where you position your audience. By twisting and turning this model, you move your audience closer to the center until their mindset encompasses this entire story narrative that you're creating. And when they're sitting right there in the center, that is when they're seeing the subject matter you're exploring from the perspective you want them to perceive it. And they are now looking at the world as you want it to be seen. And from that perspective, you're able to then say, under these conditions, in this situation, with this kind of problem, here's the proper course of action, or here's an improper course of action that you don't want to be taking. And that's your message, and that's the power of narrative, is when you convince them that by having them live through it until their minds have been moved right into the middle of that, and they're on the inside looking out rather than on the outside looking in. Okay, this program's going on a little bit longer than I intended. I want to keep these short, but I needed to put in that extra information we missed last time about the overall chart, and then give you a hint about where we're going. So next episode, we'll go a little deeper somewhere else. I think perhaps I'll start talking about the nature of the quad itself and what it means to have things in 4s. It's not arbitrary. In fact, the quad form is actually an equation, not a mathematical equation, but an equation of logic. And inside that form, you'll find that this equation, if you do a little simple algebra, the equation that we use in the model that drives the story engine in Dramatica is actually identical mathematically to E equals mc squared, which is why we call the science of how this works and how the engine works and all the mechanics, narrative mechanics again, on the inside of it, we call that science mental relativity, because it's dealing with the story mind, the mind of the whole story as if it were a single individual. And that's what we would see up here. This is a mind without a problem. This is a mind at rest. And when we take this conceptual model of the mind and we start twisting it and turning it, we create dramatic tension. Things are moved out of kilter, and they're like little ratchets. You twist it up this way, you can't untwist just by going back. It has to unfold another way by powering the forward motion of the narrative through time. And so you end up with space by this is the mind, we've twisted it up, this is its arrangement that creates this potential energy, this stored potential. And now over time, we have to unwind it and play it out until it comes to a moment of truth or a leap of faith or an epiphany or a recognition. Well, again, this is not for the casual student of story structure or wanting to learn how you write your opening line for a novel or a screenplay. This is, major heavy-duty narrative theory, and I hope you enjoy it. My whole purpose here is not so much to teach and educate as to document what I found over the last 30 years as the co-creator of the Dramatica theory, how I came to understand what we created 30 years ago. The theory has never changed, just like with Crick and Watson and DNA. It never changed. It's just that we're still learning more about how to understand it, how to appreciate it, how to implement it so that we can do things with our own DNA and in the DNA of other creatures upon the planet. Similarly, every single year that I've worked with Dramatica and narrative mechanics, we've learned more about how it applies to the real world and how you can use it in sociology and in psychology with real people and project what their behavior will be like based on different what-if scenarios, and even how it comes from our biological selves, which, because our biological selves exist in the physical world, it's that existence in the physical world that engenders the way the biology works, which then projects through into our psychology the patterns of these quads that run right back down from how we think through how we are physically into the physical world. And that's where it connects with mass and energy and space and time in the mental equivalence of knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. Those are the four internal dimensions that have a one-to-one correlation to mass and energy and space and time. And soon we'll be doing an episode just about that part of it and mental relativity. Well, that's it for this episode. I hope you found it interesting, and we'll try to give you some more specifics as we go, and also a little speculation or a broader view at the end of each episode, as we did today. Thanks for being with me. Look forward to seeing you with the next episode.